Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Lasso Anaerobic Wash Processed Colombia from September Coffee Company. And there's the bag right there. And September, based out of Ottawa, Ontario. And they're a coffee roaster that's appeared on this channel on numerous occasions, including a recent review of the Blackberry Jam, a decaf washed anaerobic processed Colombian coffee. And while purchasing that coffee, I decided to add this one alongside it, as I had heard so many positive things about this year's Lasso, including from Scott Rao, who seemed to be very high on it, but also my good buddy Ramin, who said that of all of the Apollon's Gold coffees he had tried, this one was his favorite. But since their version of this coffee is no longer available, I decided to try September's version of it, so we will see how it turned out. This right here is day 40. And recipe we went with for this coffee was our standard recipe at a 16:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 96 degrees Celsius, about 205 degrees Fahrenheit. And I like this one best through the V60, which indicates a more medium fine grind. Whereas profile for this coffee, September does have this one listed as being on the light side of their spectrum, but since I had initially purchased this coffee, they have released an extra light version of it as well. And I do have a sample of it, but unfortunately it is still resting, so I wanted to compare and contrast that version of it with this one. But for right now, we'll need to settle on this one, which definitely is on the lighter side of things, so I feel like that's probably the safest way to gauge this one, as being on the light side of the spectrum by most standards and metrics. With all that out of the way, let's go and start discussing this coffee. Day 15, first impression. And we opted for the V60, and there was initially a fair bit to take away from it, as it does offer a great bit of intensity with really nice clarity, as well as an extremely well-defined raspberry aspect, with it being very reminiscent of a seedy raspberry jam without any of the heaviness. The listed jasmine was also very much prominent and pronounced within it, so for the most part, this cup was very direct right from the onset, as you're experiencing pretty much everything that's described on this one. And I said to myself, okay, well, I didn't necessarily need to think too deeply about this one, as everything here is pretty blatant. Day 18 ran it through the Chemex, and the cup is even better today, as it felt slightly cleaner and slightly more intense, with the seedy raspberry jam still being present, but not quite as pronounced as the florality, which felt even better defined as well. In addition to that, there's a slight tropical sweetness with some dark berry depth, so it's been pretty straightforward. Yet again, a lot of the notes on here are just about as blatant as possible. We move on to day 21, as we opted for the April brewer. And the cup is still nice, as it's offering a very well-defined and prominent seedy raspberry jam yet again. One of the most well-defined red raspberry aspects we've actually ever reviewed, with a very nice level of clarity and intensity to it as well. Perhaps a bit more one-dimensional today, as it just seems to be pretty dominant in that aspect. Day 24, through the V60 with some higher temperatures and a more fine grind, we decided to push this one ever so slightly, and the cup does continue to remain very direct, with much more of the red raspberry seed aspect to it, with a slight bit less definition, as there's a little bit more brightness to it, which obviously if we're pushing it is something that we should have expected with it. A slight bit more citrus now, and the cup felt quite jammy, still very clean nonetheless, so definitely, once again, pretty consistent with some slight modifications based off of some notable adjustments to this one. Day 27 through the Chemex with the same adjustments, and interestingly, this is the most I'd enjoyed the coffee up to this point, with better definition to the floral aspects, and I really seemed to be getting some nice success off of the Chemex brews that we had with this coffee, especially earlier on. Downside is that the coffee is so direct that it's pretty straightforward with the profile, that it doesn't necessarily offer anything beyond that, and that was once again the case on this day 27 mark. So we continue on to day 30, as we decided to go back and see if it's been just time that seemed to help this coffee, or if it's been the adjustments we had made, as we ran it back through the V60 with our standard recipe, and it felt like it's back to its best, as it feels reminiscent of the initial experience with a slight bit more intensity. So I attributed time to really impacting the overall results of this coffee. It has aged with plenty of clarity and definition yet again on the focused red raspberry aspect, almost reminiscent of what I would describe as a brisk raspberry lemonade tea. Very nice in that sense, though truth be told, the citrus was maybe not necessarily quite as prominent as a lot of the other notes within this coffee. Day 33 through the Chemex was our standard recipe, and the coffee felt like it perhaps dropped off ever so slightly, as it's still offering plenty of the well-defined red raspberry aspects, but in a slightly more faint scent, so it could have just been an off day. But because of this, despite the very strong success we'd had with the Chemex early on, I said we'll brew this one more time and decide to go with the V60 for this one. And on day 36, we tried it that last time, and once again, the cup continues to remain extremely blatant and straightforward as possible, with a red raspberry theme to it yet again, and much more of those perfumey-like floral aspects once again, with a notable grape-like tartness too. Slightly citric with a much more fruit-focused brightness as well. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. And we have quite a few level 4s, so let's go through those, and we'll start with the cleanliness level 4. So I have to say right off bat, I think that this is probably one of the most important things about this coffee, and that's that it was very, very clean, especially for it being a slightly more processed coffee. Though I have said in the past that washed anaerobic wash processed coffees don't always have the same sort of intensity in terms of the funkiness or fermentiness that other processed coffees seem to have. So that might have been at play with this one, but regardless of that, it did seem to offer tremendous definition to the flavor profiles within this coffee. So I don't think that that's surprising in any regard, as the cleanliness is very high within this coffee, and definitely one of the highest we've experienced for a coffee that is processed in this manner. Finish level 4, and even then the finish is actually a lot more even, as this coffee could have easily skewed into the overbearing category, but it didn't. While it's very red fruit forward, and I've experienced so many coffees that are way too red fruit forward, it's red fruit forward in a much more even sense with great definition to it, finishing off at a much more even tone without it lasting too long and too overbearing. And that's why it's nice that the sweetness matches that at that level 4 mark. And what's so interesting about that is if you look at the bottom of this tasting wheel, none of the other factors seem to score even moderately high. So for that reason, it's interesting that this coffee is pretty much dominated by fruit brightness, which isn't always the case. And there's definitely a fair bit of the tropical fruit brightness in that berried sense. I think they have passion fruit as one of the notes they have describing this coffee, and I could definitely see that, as that's quite prominent within it. But outside of that, while the red raspberry and the slight grape-like tones aren't necessarily the most, we'll say, sweet part of this coffee, they also do offer some sweetness. So the entirety of the sweetness is made up by fruits, which is kind of interesting. Acidity, level 4, and that is also kind of interesting because once again, it's a fruit brightness. There's a lot of fruit brightness within this coffee too, so those two things being at that high measure is pretty interesting within it. And that takes us to the florals at the level 4, and there's so many of those jasmine-like aspects within it. And yeah, since this coffee is slightly more processed, it's a little bit more intense as opposed to the much more subtle-like aspects that you can experience with something like a Panamanian Geisha per se. But even then, having that much more intense floral aspect to complement the fruit forward profile of it does give this coffee at least a second dimension to it. Otherwise, this coffee might be a little bit too one note, with it offering a lot of those fruit aspects. And that's where the berry fruit comes into play at that level 4. And I feel like if maybe we're just kind of judging this based off the raspberry aspect of it, you could probably justify it there at that level 5. There is really nice definition to the other aspects, that grape-like tone to it, that passion fruit-like tone to it, all of which fall into that berry category. So for that reason, it is justified there at that level 4. As I'm kind of thinking about it, I guess you could say level 5, definitely higher side of level 4, given that that's where the vast majority of the fruit aspects in terms of the brightness and sweetness all come from, is that berry category. One level 3, and that is the body, and this one did have a little bit of a medium body. I think they describe it as silky, and that makes a lot of sense as there's a little bit of texture to it. Yeah, the tasting wheel skews very heavily in certain directions, and then it doesn't really offer much in others. So I think the only other thing that I wanted to touch on real briefly is the bitterness, because there's a slight bit of fruit bitterness to this one, and I think it's because it's ever so slightly tart in a lot of ways. But outside of that, yeah, I mean, there's not too much to discuss on this tasting wheel. It's pretty direct, it's pretty self-explanatory. I do think it's pretty good representation of what I was getting from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. I do think it's kind of funny that Scott Rouse seemed to be very high on it, because the entire time I was drinking this coffee, I said that it reminds me so much of a lot of the Prodigal coffees that I have had in the past, and I can definitely see a lot of similarities, especially given that this is a Colombian coffee. So that doesn't surprise me. But on that same theme, this coffee was never something that sounded like my profile sort of coffee going into it. I made this purchase just because of how many positive things I'd heard about Wilder Lasso's coffees, but when I purchased the coffee and took a look at the description, I said, it would be kind of surprising if I really seemed to enjoy this coffee, but who knows, it might surprise me. And yeah, it was pretty interesting in a number of ways, mostly because of just how much definition and how blatant the coffee was. But for me, I think it was actually kind of an issue by the end that it was so direct, because this coffee for me felt a little bit too one and kind of two-dimensional, as I had a little bit of difficulty maybe pulling out additional things outside of the very fruit prominent aspects of this one. And while I've said in the past that if you can offer really nice clarity, sweetness, a fruit profile, and a floral profile, then I will enjoy it, that's still the case. But I think with this one, given that it was offering a fruit profile that isn't necessarily in line with my own preferences, then for that reason, it didn't necessarily reach that mark. But even then, there were a lot of positives to be taken away from this one, and I can certainly see why a number of people were huge fans of it. The type of person I would suggest this coffee to, if you love red raspberries, go for it on this one. I can't recommend and suggest this one enough, because the definition and clarity of that aspect in this coffee was just about as pronounced and prominent as I've experienced from any coffee ever. In addition to that, it's still offering great clarity, and it's not too intense for a slightly more processed coffee, but even then it still offers plenty of intensity for a lot of people that do enjoy slightly more intense coffees as well. So that gives you a number of reasons why you would enjoy it. In addition to that, a nice complementary floral component, giving it that slight second dimension as well. I think that's the best direction I can point somebody towards for this one, and the best way I can leave this review. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I'd love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Lasso Anaerobic Wash Process Colombia from September Coffee Company. Thank you for watching.